So I'm Ed Gibney. I'm one of the leaders for the Evolutionary Philosophy Circle. I co-lead with Andy Norman and with David Sloan Wilson. So all of these words are mine, not theirs. So don't hold that against them. But I have a lot of emails in the background with David, especially about how the group's going. And after one of our meetings a couple weeks ago, he asked me to speak about how our group was going at this meeting. And I said, sure, that's easy. But then they got the email last week saying Ed's going to lead this this group. I thought, oh, geez, I should maybe do a little more than just my little spiel. So, you know, from my old days of working in management consulting, I know that, you know, one of the first things you do when you want to improve a process that I think we're all kind of, you know, maybe struggling with a little bit is the first thing you want to do is map it out. And so I just thought I'd present sort of a map of our process to date so far. And what I'm hoping is that, you know, this is just a first step in the group as a whole, working to improve upon this and make it much smoother for future generations. So I hope to put this on the high-low after we discuss it and can move on. But my contact information is there at the bottom of the first page too, if anybody ever wants to discuss it. So these are the steps in our process, right from that I'm going to talk about today, right from the project design through to goal setting, where we are today. That sort of, you know, takes us from the very beginnings right through to the end of the prosocial tasks that all of the projects are sharing in general. And then I'll share a couple thoughts on how we're driving engagement all along the way as well too. But I know we're all going through this, so I'm going to try to speed through this as much as possible, and we're all living it, so I don't need to tell you too much about these things. So the first one is project design. And, you know, we, our particular project kind of came out from several emails that David and Andy and myself were having about how do we create a philosophy department in Evolutionary University online. And from several discussions back and forth, we ended up shaping a little project proposal that went on high-low like the rest of us. And that had its, you know, we did okay with that, I'd say. But then a couple weeks later, I just wanted to point out that Andy in particular brought up a great idea that I wish we had thought about before, was a book called Start With Why. And it's from Simon Sinek, and he's got a fantastic TED Talk. If you haven't seen it, it's up to like 58 million views on it right now. And he has this you know, sort of three-pronged approach at how great leaders inspire, how you know, how you get people to buy into what you're doing. And he's speaking back in 2009, so he's talking about like Dell versus Apple at the time. But you know, he would talk about, you know, Dell as an example of leading with what they do, saying, okay, we sell computers dirt cheap. How do we do that? Through the internet with no middlemen. And why? Well, we all need computers, right? And we all want to, you know, and we want to make some money. So that's not the kind of inspiring message. Whereas, you know, he talked about Apple starting with the why, saying, you know, we want to change the world. How do we do that? We give revolutionaries the tools they need. And what do? Well, we make these computers, and these tools, you can buy them here. And he gives that's you know, a business example, but he goes through lots of other examples from Martin Luther King and other inspirational leaders. And you know, I think our philosophy group touched on these things a little bit in our project proposal, but I wish we had thought about that a little bit more consciously ahead of time, to be able to say, you know, why are we meeting? Is it, and to us, it's to shake up the philosophy world. How are we going to do that? We want to bring the latest findings from evolution to the field, and we have the great David Sloan Wilson on board with us to help us do that. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to do all these prosocial processes and tasks to get that done. And I think that would have helped our design process just a little bit better. And maybe it's something else that other people can think of as they start designing their projects going forward too. So, but still, we started doing fairly well, and we got onto recruitment process. You know, our proposal on high-low started to attract a few people, but David, Andy, and myself sent out lots of emails to different philosophers we do kind of around the world to see if they were interested in joining us with this. But the project proposal was just stuck on high-low that no one could really see. So I ended up creating a website or some information on my own website to be able to share that information publicly. So, up in the upper left, I had a little just banner on the front page of my website. And then I created a specific blog post where I went through, I just gathered lots of information about Prosocial. At the time, David was kind of sharing this 2-hour webinar that he gave where he's introducing to Prosocial Commons. And that was, great, but probably too much of a fire hose for some people. So I gathered lots of little chunks I could find about Prosocial out there. I wrote up a little summary. I found a 7-minute movie that Alan Honigan had worked on with David almost several years ago. A link to the book. And then I found, 3 different introductions from the 3 authors of Prosocial. So David wrote a long introduction on the, I want to say 212th anniversary of Darwin's birthday, something like that, is when Prosocial world was first birthed. Paul Atkins had a little 12-minute read kind of introducing it. And Stephen Hayes had a little 7-minute video about it. So I sort of gathered all of these pieces on a website. That way people could dive into it as much as they needed to, and then also kind of read about our specific project as well. And that may or may not have helped them. I'm not quite sure. I don't have statistics on who dove into that, but the more the better. And if this can help others, happy to share these things. So then we started getting people to come along, and this is, we had all of these different steps that we've taken to get through donating Prosocial Commons, joining high-low, and this is what I call entering the shepherding phase. And I ended up creating a spreadsheet to keep track of this. So I have columns on here for all of the people that we recruited, whether or not they were able to donate to Prosocial Commons, whether they joined high-low, whether they found our project, and then eventually whether they found our group when we had to do that, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then, I just kind of use this as sort of a rough customer relationship management tool to make sure I knew where everyone was going, and because it was quite tricky, and there wasn't a good way to do it using high-low, or since we were operating, as David likes to say, high tech, low tech, no tech, we'll meet them anywhere. So that means that made for a lot of work to keep track of everyone. But eventually we got enough people, and we achieved liftoff, where I thought we were all going along great, and suddenly David wrote us saying, okay, now we're going to change these projects into a group. And I didn't know that was happening, didn't warn anybody about that. This was yet kind of another administrative hurdle. And I bring this up specifically because I just had a meeting earlier this week with someone who still didn't know about how groups and subgroups work, and this was kind of vital. Jim, he's here in this meeting today. I need to call him out, but yeah, this is just kind of another hurdle on the process that was difficult. That might have been good to have known that right from the start. But anyway, we got the projects going, and we started. We had our own little bubble in the Prosocial world. And we finally started trying to arrange meetings. And for our group, that was pretty tricky. We have members from Hawaii, -10 UTC, all the way to Japan, +9 UTC. Members kind of all around the globe. And we just weren't gonna be able to find a time to meet with very easily, I thought. So, I put together this little table to show when are good working times, and I figured we might have to do one Atlantic focus time and one Pacific focus time possibly, but it turned out for us, we were lucky that our Hawaii guy is a super early bird, and our member from Japan is happy to be a night owl, so we were able to find just sort of one time to meet. But we kind of really have to recognize, I think across Prosocial as a whole, that you really have to work asynchronously. That not everybody's gonna be able to make meetings. If we're gonna make this Prosocial a world around the world, you're gonna have to use high-low and write things up online so that people can kind of catch up and work on it as they want. And later on, once we, our first meeting, we struggled a little bit with Zoom tools, but then by the second time, we got it set up so that I'm calling it we had like a water cooler feature where anyone can hop on at any time. Anyone's the host of whenever you jump on, anyone can share screens. And that's going to end up, I think, being a really useful tool for our group, for groups in general. So I was glad to finally to get that for us. So now straight into the prosocial tasks themselves. You know, the first one was coming up with the CDP agreement. How do we do that? We all watched the first intro from David Wilson on the PC Cafe, either live or shared on video later. We weren't meeting yet, so we put kind of a post on Hilo and sent out an email about it as well, with just all the instructions on what we were supposed to do and how we can do it. And we just asked people to do this, you know, in writing by just sharing your thoughts on Hilo or email. And over about a week, I guess, yeah, we sort of just gathered those thoughts. And at the end of it, I basically just copied all of the comments that people had some very light editing and put them into a Google Doc online. That's we're calling now sort of a living document. That's, you know, it's our agreement that anybody can go in and look at it and comment on it. And, you know, we're seeing comments trickle on here and there. And I imagine as we meet and struggle or succeed, we'll want to change that and revisit it. That, so, you know, that's sort of always there. I know, yeah, okay, that's good. Next up was the group matrix. So once again, we had another intro from David Wilson. We watched all that video. And that was about the time that we actually had our successful first meeting. And I figured it was probably gonna be way too difficult to run through, you know, an ACT matrix with lots of psychological exposures and vulnerabilities and sharing. And we didn't even know each other at all. We had never met, had never spoken. We're not a group that existed before, like most of the other groups on here. So our first agenda was really just, and Dave and Andy, as you can see from line one, couldn't make that meeting either. So it's just me and a handful of people who, you know, we just introduced ourselves and kind of discussed, you know, what do we want to see out of this group? And since I had been working with David behind the scenes on several things, I had a lot of answers for a lot of questions that people had. So that's really what our first meeting was about. And that ended up going, you know, an hour and a half or more to kind of get through some things. But then, you know, the task then of working on a collective matrix, we went through the same process we did for week one for the CDP agreement and just asked people to write those online. And that seemed to work pretty well. And at the end of the week, we also created another living document on Google. Again, this one was using Google Slides though. We had received a template from Juliet and the Prosocial team that you can see maybe, yeah, in the upper left-hand corner, which was great, really let you see the matrix very well, but that was too small to share the thoughts from an entire group in there. So just copy them into these kind of blank slides have a different slide for each quadrant essentially. And that again is a living document that we can kind of go into and comment on any time. So finally, goal setting, the last of the prosocial tasks. Once again, we had an intro from David Wilson. And in our original project proposal, I had listed, you know, a lot of potential ideas for what our philosophy group could do. We weren't going to do them all in the first 12 weeks. So I shared with the group this kind of larger vision on a PowerPoint slide of, you know, when we might be able to do all of those different tasks, all of the different outputs that we could have. And you know, had my ideas for what maybe we could accomplish in generation one. But we came to a meeting, the week 3 meeting, and had our first real kind of discussion on prosocial activities. Whereas the first meeting was just getting to know each other. This second meeting, which Dave and Andy were at, which was really helpful, we discussed the goal setting, and I brought two particular ideas and items or handouts to the meeting, really. One on the left was this concept I got from a facilitator's workbook years ago called the groan zone, where just any kind of time a group has to make a decision, the groups will start out with a bit of divergent thinking where everybody's just kind of chucking ideas, bringing new thoughts into the process. And then eventually, you can see on the right, the group starts to converge and make a decision. And what the groan zone is just kind of recognizes that, almost right off the bat, some people are going to be ready to make a decision, want to finish the discussion, while other people are still just throwing out ideas and say, hey, what about this? What about that? And there's this tension in between a group sometimes about where we are in this process. Are we still thinking, or are we deciding? And I just wanted to reiterate to the group that we're just in this first week of talking about goals. We're still in this divergent process. Like I have my ideas, but I want to hear from everybody. So we spent that whole discussion thinking up ideas, and we had a whole other week to write them up online as well too. The other handout I brought was a little summary of a book called the Breakthrough Strategy that David had talked about Robert Schaefer's work in his cafe, where Schaefer had set up an organization called Rapid Results Institute. And that was, we read David's book, Atlas Hugged. It was kind of an inspiration for his 100-day march in that book as well too, of achieving something amazing in a short amount of time. But that was based on earlier research that Schaefer had done in this book called Breakthrough Strategy, where he identified, tasks that organizations have done that were kind of extraordinary and real things that people never thought were possible, but somehow they were managing to get this done. And he made a study of collecting examples of these all around the world and tried to understand what did these instances have in common that allowed them to happen. And he came up with 5 particular qualities that they all had, and that was listed here, that they were urgent, compelling, a first step goal, and then kind of the things we see in SMART goal setting, and also what we see in the CDP in terms of that the responsible participants are there and they have the available resources and authority. So I wanted us to think about, as we set our goals, to search for, could we come up with a breakthrough goal for this first setting, this first session. So again, we discussed that in the meeting. We shared our thoughts on Hilo and email for a week. And then we had a whole other week. So week 4 has been kind of a breather, a catch up that was listed. But I think that was actually really nice for goal setting, to turn goal setting into a 2-week process for us. So in there, since everybody was kind of catching up too on the different prosocial tasks so far, I pulled together everything we had done for tasks into a little PowerPoint slide, sent that around to everybody ahead of time. And we looked at, what was in CDP agreement for CDP number 1 in particular, because that was really the one that's about, what is a shared purpose and vision and what tasks might we do. I looked at the first 2 quadrants in the matrix. So, what are the values we have? And then what are the tasks? What would we do if we were living up to those values? And then I also summarized what was in our goal setting discussions to date. And looking through that, we ended up finding that there was a lot of commonality. Luckily, almost everyone in the group seemed to really value learning, teaching, and kind of reading and discussing things. So from that, we ended up agreeing to our first set of tasks in just generation 1, which I'll just mention quickly. Is we're planning to discuss philosophy at each of our weekly meetings. We'll try to cover a different branch of philosophy each time and see how evolution is impacting on that. But that's just going to be kind of a short discussion each week, a chance to get to know each other and share our thoughts about some things. And online, we'll try to gather sort of suggested reading lists for each of those branches, each of those elements of evolutionary philosophy. And by the end of that, then we will end up having kind of a shared identity. You know, we'll really understand what our CDP1 is, what our shared purpose is. And we'll have a little curriculum as well too, a little reading list is sort of what our goals are for the end of this first task, first generation, I should say. So that's where we are today, you know, at the end of the prosocial process. But I just want to share a few thoughts on driving engagement. That was another big topic of conversation behind the scenes with David and other members and leaders who are kind of struggling with that. And I've had sort of two main thoughts about that I wanted to share. The first was when I hear engagement, I know about, I think of the research that the Gallup group has done on customer or sort of employee engagement is a real focus of their research. Most of us know the Gallup poll, the Gallup company from the Gallup poll, but that ends up being only like 1% of their revenue. I interviewed for a job with them years and years ago, so I learned a bunch of this stuff behind the scenes. That they make most of their money using their polling expertise to do organizational consulting. So they've surveyed millions of employees in thousands of organizations around the world. They've been testing and tweaking all of their questions in order to, and then running regressions, analyses between what are the answers, what are the questions, and what are the results from each of these organizations, subgroups, and individuals. And they've, through all these years, have come up with just 12 pretty simple questions that really help drive engagement in your employees, and that has a huge impact on your bottom line in your organization. And so, I've worked on this in the past with some of the people I've worked with, that I'm always thinking of these Q12, as they're called, to see how can we get people more engaged. And since that was the problem we were faced with Prosocial, I turned to that as well too. So I'll talk about that in just a minute. But just yesterday, I had another thought about this, that I think we put a lot of faith and stock in the beginning of this prosocial process that people would be very active and engaged, because we asked them to, donate some money to Prosocial and promise to work on this just 1 to 2 hours a week. Doesn't sound like much, but I thought of this today, that it sounds a lot like a gym membership. And we all know how gym memberships, we're willing to sign up for them, and we all have great intentions and we think it's gonna be great, but then we just don't follow through and change our habits. And so I think there's something to be said there about how can we think about getting people into the gym, essentially, a Prosocial, that I haven't thought about yet, but it's worth sharing now, so we can start thinking about that for the next month. So quickly, I had just had 3 of the elements from Q12 that I went through. So one of the questions that I thought was really important was, I know what is expected of me. If you don't, it's really hard to be engaged with what you're doing. And I know this prosocial process was really confusing for a lot of people. There is emails and high-low and new technologies coming online all the time. And I ended up creating an online checklist using a Google spreadsheet that kind of became, I wanted to be a one-stop shop for everything we were doing. So we have a list of all the tasks, a list of people's initials. Each of the tasks has a hyperlink directly to where you can do this, get this task done. So I pin this to the top of our high-low group, and it's maybe it's an easy place for people to catch up and just sort of understand where we're going. And I shared that with the group, and within a week, this is the screenshot I took of it, that most of the people that were kind of our regular comers were using this and seemed to like it. So we're carrying on with that, and I think it's proving to be pretty useful. The second Q12 one that I really thought about a lot was, I have the tools that I need. If you don't, it's hard to be engaged with your work. And we were using all sorts of new tools in this project. So, I spent a fair bit of time thinking about how to make sure that, people's high-low experience was as good as we could get it. And I was always ready to talk to people about the Google Docs in particular, which I'm not super strong on, but luckily I think our group was pretty good with online technologies. So we've managed to do that. And then the last one was, I have a best friend at work. So this is probably the most controversial Q12 from Gallup that a lot of managers don't think about too much, or think it's soft and squishy and don't want to deal with it. But we can all imagine going to a job that sucks, but if you have a best friend there, you still want to come and share through the bad times. Or vice versa, if you can have a great job but don't really like anybody around you, you're not going to feel that engaged to go. So this is what Gallup has found over years, that turns out to be a really useful question. It's not something you can force on people, but it's something you can create space for. And so I think this water cooler feature on Zoom is really useful to let just people hop on and chat possibly. I try to open up our meetings 10 to 15 minutes early if people want to come on and chat. And then at our last meeting, I just did a little silly quiz that I found online of who said it, Friedrich Nietzsche or SpongeBob SquarePants. We had just 10 questions, 10 quotes from one of those people we had to guess. And that's sort of just to create a fun, silly space. So I'm just trying to make sure we have room for that in our group. So that's the process where we are to date, and we'll open it up for questions in a moment, but I'll start with my own question first. Was why is this so hard? Why was this so much to do? If we really want to make this pro-social process, a world and not a sort of gated community for just the people that have the time and space to do all this, I think we're really going to have to work on streamlining this and improving it. And maybe I went overboard. I'm prone to do that, but this would be something I'd like the group to really work on in the future for future generations. And with that, I will stop.